There's a new paddle club opening every 100 minutes. It's like no sport I've seen, worldwide. The numbers behind the sport are pretty phenomenal. You can call it a sport. I see it more as a social operating system. People are getting together. It's this big matchmaking phenomenon where people are getting on court together, making friends, romantic partners, business partners. There are countless examples of people playing this sport and it's spinning off into something else that's shifted their life. This kind of idea of paddle as a new golf, I think that's where the real touch point is. I love golf, but who has time for 18 holes?
Hello and welcome to another episode of Ways to Wealth. Today I am joined by Ben. Ben, why don't you give us the TLDR on who you are and what you get up to?
Hi Charlie, thanks for having me on. Ben Nichols. I'm an entrepreneur and an advisor and an industry builder, I suppose, in the paddle industry. So a sport which has kind of caught the eye as the fastest growing worldwide. I got involved 4 years ago, following a career in sports communications, and saw an opportunity to create the first agency in the sport and help build out its profile internationally. And so I've got an ecosystem of businesses in the sport. I'm focusing on the new markets, so US, UK, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, you name it. And I'm sure we'll speak more about that today.
Yeah, cool. So, it's interesting. It is a sport that's kind of got a lot of traction. The kind of 1 to 2 player sport has gained a lot of traction, like globally, when it comes to sports in general and what people are spending their time on. I've noticed like a massive increase in those sort of activities over the last, I would say, 10 years, but 5 years especially, since the pandemic perhaps even. Less kind of team sports or larger team sports and more kind of independent or duo sports.
Yeah, absolutely. So look, paddle is 99% of the time is 4 people on court. And it is unique. It's like no sport I've seen, worldwide. You can call it a sport. I see it more as a social operating system. There are countless examples. There's data to back it up that this is a sport that's kind of being embedded into people's daily lives in a kind of third space way, where you've got your work, your home, and then you've got the paddle club. People are getting together. It's this big matchmaking phenomenon where people are getting on court together, making friends, romantic partners, business partners. It's become this real glue for people meeting and socializing off the back of the pandemic. So paddle, a sport, is, yes, it's interesting, it's fun to play, but actually it's what it's doing to transform people's lives as a connector in corporate and business communities, and many others. And it's a case study that I think we're going to talk about for years and years, because there's just huge swathes of people getting on court in all these different countries that are adopting it.
And in terms of kind of that business journey, like what made you start it, and was it your first rodeo, or had you already had a few kind of experiences in terms of business ownership and actually starting your own thing? Like what was the kind of decision making there?
Sure. So I'd had a career of 20 years in the sports communications industry. I'd had a pretty fascinating career, having managed media during the Russian doping scandal for the World Anti-Doping Agency. So I say to anyone, go and watch the movie Icarus, which was an Oscar-winning movie. That was my life for 4 years. And that was all about the Russian state-sponsored doping scandal. I managed PR as the press officer of the Dubai Tennis Championships for 2 years in the UAE. I worked as head of comms for an F1 team. So I had a really, what I thought was a really interesting, very varied, rich sports communications career. And I grew up as a racket sports player, squash and tennis. So 4 years ago, I saw paddle in the UK as this sport that I thought was going to be the next big thing. And I thought, actually, this could be the biggest thing we see in participation sport of my lifetime. And I thought, look, there's businesses getting involved, there's investors, entrepreneurs, there's court builders, club builders out there starting to really build this sport, but there's no one focusing on the storytelling. So I'm someone that always had an entrepreneurial streak, and I thought with my career I was perfectly placed to grow the profile of this sport. I call it growing brand paddle in what I call the new paddle world, and that's all of the non-Hispanic markets. So New Zealand is very much at its infancy, but is one of those countries. Australia, America, the UK, South Africa, all of these countries that are adopting paddle. I thought that there's going to need to be a narrative and a position around this sport of how it's different. And I thought I was perfectly placed to tell that story. So that's what I've been doing the last 4 years. It wasn't my first rodeo, but it was the first one that I've bootstrapped off my own accord by creating an agency. and subsequently an ecosystem of businesses around the sport, connecting from different sides. And that's what I'm doing today, and it's a hugely kind of fascinating and exhilarating space to be in.
And what do you think the biggest surprise you've experienced in the journey so far, in the experience of building the business, but maybe even specifically in the paddle industry, or even kind of something new from this?
Yeah, look, biggest surprise, actually, I would say, there's been so many positives with this. So the numbers behind the sport are pretty phenomenal. There's a new paddle club opening every 100 minutes globally, which is just, unheard of. You've got kind of, depending on which report you read, you've got anything between 20 million and 35 million players internationally. You've got Olympic prospects, maybe as soon as 2032. There's so much positive around the sport, and there's anecdotal evidence kind of in abundance of people absolutely kind of loving this sport. However, the biggest surprise, I think, is kind of non-endemic brands and mainstream companies that have yet to enter the sport as a sponsorship or investment opportunity. We've started to see a few. There's kind of car brands like Alpine and Cupra. We've seen Motorola in the US get involved. Public supermarkets, big US supermarket chain. Vitality in the UK, big insurance provider. So there are some, but I think there's been a lot of kind of drag in terms of the big companies out there that have yet to put their chips down in paddle. Particularly when you look at the data around the sport and the first-hand evidence and kind of anecdotes of people, how it's changed their lives. I think it's a great commercial opportunity for brands. And I think the brands have been a little bit slow at kind of putting themselves in there, particularly as if you enter a sport like this in its early days, you can get in at a more affordable rate than if you get in down the line when it's established. So I think that's been the biggest surprise, is just the non-endemic brands being a little bit cautious as to going all in paddle, when I think everything points towards this, this sport that has massive opportunity. And actually, a lot of these brands want to reach the demographic of the paddle player, which is, by and large, is executives, C-suites, is corporate professionals, it's successful people playing paddle. And some of these companies take years and decades to try and reach them through their marketing campaigns. And here are these players, very receptive to, being received, I suppose, by these brands and their messages.
Well, I think the kind of trend is on, or the interesting point you raise is around attention. How do you get attention in this modern day? And is there an arbitrage to be had in terms of utilizing grassroots activities to see if you can get a good return on investment, while potentially obviously supporting things that your organization may actually think is a good idea in the world, right? So that's kind of the two parts to it. Is what does it say about the organization, and is it the client that the client archetype you want to reach, and how do you reach them in a cost effective way? Now, I can imagine that they would say, well, it's harder to quantify, and it's a lot more work because it's not as an established channel as, let's say, throwing some ads up on an ad network or doing a billboard. It is very much kind of guerrilla marketing, I would say, dabbling in that kind of recreational grassroots kind of era and sport. But with my background in esports, obviously that was something where you saw a lot of sponsorship at a grassroots level in the early days as well. But it's also similar to this. I do a lot of jiu-jitsu. That's a sport that has just absolutely exploded. It's kind of now like the modern day karate if you look at the actual adoption. And obviously jiu-jitsu practitioners would not want to hear you say that, because obviously karate took a bit of a downward turn. I would say, especially from a branding perspective, and hasn't really ever recovered. And then obviously you've had the advent of MMA. But then, other sports like, very fascinated, someone involved in an organization does underwater hockey.
Yeah, okay.
What the heck?
They've thought of everything, right?
So, that's two things, right? Yeah, is that there's lots of games, but I think specifically it's around these kind of more decentralized games that I think are pick up and play kind of games that are kind of interesting from a trend perspective.
Yeah. Well, look, the unique thing I see of paddle is you think about most mainstream sports like that people might follow, tennis, golf, football. We'll watch them, we'll follow them on TV, we'll have our kind of, superstars that we follow and we know about. And some of those people might play the sport as well. Paddle's the opposite. I think, with no disparaging kind of comments to the professional game, they're at the top of their craft. The interest isn't, when we talk about paddle and this kind
It's
of
not a
phenomenon,
viewer.
it's not on the professional side. It's not on broadcast,
Yeah.
broadcast footage. It's not on going to watch the tournaments, good as they are. If they're in your backyard, yes, you might go and watch. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about
Yeah.
playing. We're talking about this experience of it fitting into your life. Because, like I said, you've met your new romantic partner, you've met a new friend, you've met a new or social circle, you've met a business partner. There are countless examples of people playing this sport and it's spinning off into something else that's shifted their life. And that's what we're talking about here, is a participation first sport. And yes, over years and time, those players who become obsessed with the sport might then go and watch a Premier Padel event if it comes to their home city. They might go and click onto YouTube more. They might, turn onto a broadcaster if it becomes on mainstream. So those people will convert eventually. And I think the professional sport, side of the sport will get more and more of interest. But if I'm honest, that's not what paddle is about. Paddle is about
Well,
experience.
jiu-jitsu has been not in the professional side either, and it's because it's not a great viewing experience.
Yeah. Okay. Well, and the jury's out.
Not that paddle necessarily is or isn't, but I would say that one thing is the professional scene there's a lot of people interested in it, but the money or the kind of I guess the real measures of is the actual sport being successful is probably other metrics.
For sure. Yeah, for sure.
Watching. Which, like, when you think about FIFA, like the football and the Premier League, you're thinking about those big cups and that viewing experience.
Yeah. Look, nine paddle players out of 10, I'd say players, amateurs, people playing the sport won't have heard of one of the professional players, and that's where we are. Again, that might change over time, but I think there's a long road ahead before you convert those players into avid fans of the professional side. So look, there's the opportunity for paddle, and actually coming back to these brands, it's reaching people. So I had a business called Property and Paddle, which is, as it sounds, is connecting the real estate community and corporates.
Right.
Corporate networking through paddle. And it's not bringing people together to talk about paddle. It's bringing people together to, lower their inhibitions and actually network in a non-forced way. And paddle's the vehicle. They've got on court, they've sweated, they've laughed, they've had a bit of banter, and off the court they're then having a beer or a smoothie or whatever it is together. So corporate, it lowers people's guards, as brings them down to human level, and they can connect and talk business without being, having a name badge on at a drinks event. So that's at the corporate level where I think it really can resonate. And that's where, businesses can get in and they can get their pitch across in a more authentic way and make those connections to do deals, etc. So this kind of idea of paddle as a new golf, I think that's where the real touch point is with the corporate sector. It's, I love golf, but who has time for 18 holes? And golf clubs have, done it well for years. They've also had problems as a sport in being super inclusive. Paddle doesn't have to be that way, and it's much quicker. It's more modern. It's just, it's got so many kind of touch points that can meet the corporate person, where they are, I suppose. So there's a huge opportunity with this sport, and I think I'm seeing it more and more in countries like the UK and US where it's tapping into that crowd.
Makes me think a lot about what we're doing with our time, like globally, and how people are having these very serious interests now, or maybe that's always existed. But I don't know. I feel like there's been a shift because of social media, because of the distribution of like information and streaming content and providing content and learning from the best. Like the fact that we can look on Instagram and we've got basically an infinite feed of the best paddle players having fun and creating fun like clips and moments in the game, or in jiu-jitsu in terms of seeing people try the moves, demonstrate them, teach them. It kind of just talks to potentially, what I guess life looks like when you do actually have a lot of time saved through technology, and then what do humans do is they find other ways to compete. And you're almost finding kind of amateur competitions with perks that are emerging in this grassroots sport era, and I think paddle is like a clear example of that, and actually probably one of the earlier trends than like a jiu-jitsu now that I think has had a very solid trend now for a long time. I'd say that paddle has a larger like general appeal.
Yeah.
Because it's all relative, because I think that paddle can be a lot bigger than jiu-jitsu and is more accessible than jiu-jitsu, because you can't just really jump in and try jiu-jitsu. Whereas the paddle, like the road in is like nicer.
Yeah.
But golf as well. I think golf had a bit of a comeback, from what I've seen from a recreational perspective.
Yeah, definitely. A few really interesting points there. I think, number one, the barrier to play paddle, and you could argue something like pickleball as well, which is obviously big in America, super low, right? Squash, tennis, golf, pretty technical sport. But paddle, really easy to pick up. So there's no barrier there. That you don't need to be a racket sports person. You will very quickly, even if you're not athletic, quickly make contact with the ball. When you make contact, there's enjoyment. You're going to pick it up quickly. So that there's a low barrier there. It doesn't carry, because of its age, probably doesn't carry the traditional kind of elitist perception that some of the other sports do. Some people love that and it has its place. Some people are put off by that. So again, an opportunity for paddle to reach the masses through it's just how it's positioned and seen. But I think also just like you touched on there, like do I want to go and watch a paddle game on ESPN or a broadcaster in its entirety? Probably not, as your average guy. Do I want to go and watch a quick YouTube or a quick kind of Instagram bite of an amazing rally where the ball's flying out the court and stuff? Absolutely. Yeah, it's pretty entertaining. But you've also got these other kind of content pieces it's cutting across. It's cutting across celebrities, athletes and other people from entertainment who are just playing it. So it's, you're kind of seeing them promote it just because they love playing it. You're seeing you're seeing some lifestyle brands get involved because they see the demographic as being quite aligned with who they're trying to reach. You're seeing it kind of touch into this lifestyle is the word I'd use, right? People just sort of enjoying it.
Lifestyle activity comes, lifestyle brands can come on board with it.
Yeah, that's what I come back to, right? It's lifestyle. It's people like they're enjoying it, and you could call it a trend. I would say, it's beyond that now. I'd say it's very much emerging as something that's here for the long term. But it's people embedding it into their lives in some way, just like they're having enjoying a good coffee or kind of non-alcoholic.
It's quite an investment though, right, to get the courts.
It sure is, yeah. So look, you've got the groundworks, unless you've got perfectly kind of flat tennis surface, you've got groundworks, and then you've got the construction. You could be talking pounds, you could be talking 50, 60,000 pounds or more. There's quite an investment. You compare that to like a pickleball court, where essentially you can get a net on a piece of tarmac, chalk some lines, and you're away. There's no barrier there. So that's the disadvantage paddle has. It's super costly to build a court because of the glass and the cage and just like I said, the groundworks. So but you've got the economics are pretty attractive. You've got 4 people on a court. You put it indoor, then you don't have to worry about the weather. And you build a good paddle club with all of these wellness things around: cold plunges, saunas, good coffee, good smoothies, events. There's so many kind of ancillary activities where you can monetize this sport, and that's kind of, in my view, separates the good operators from the not so good. Is not seeing this as a transactional on court and off court thing. It's like, how can you keep people at that club and keep them there as long as possible. And that's where you embed some of these things. And
I guess, like, for what does success like? If you fast forward 5 years, then what does success look like for you and the business? And like, are there any milestones that you think about around hitting to know that you've achieved that? Or
yeah, look, I think I hear a lot anecdotally of people talking about kind of myself and others sort of like what we've done to try and elevate the position of the sport, and that's great. And it's great to receive compliments in that way. It's like we're doing something right. But I think kind of more structurally, it's like come back to the non-endemic brands. Who are some of the major companies that have entered the sport, sponsoring it, investing in it? Those will all be signs of success in my view, because they do their due diligence. They might have a passionate CEO. That's often the entry point, who's a decision maker, but then they need to look at the business case. So seeing more of these mainstream companies enter the sport, I think, would be a sign of, okay, this is here. Olympic status for sure. Like some people see that as the holy grail. Yes, it does come with baggage. Like, it comes with pathways and medal targets and costs and getting in the school systems and university systems in place. That's all a lot of baggage and headaches from an administrative point of view. But in terms of like the tangible of it being an Olympic sport, that would be a sign of success. I think, look, what are the things, institutional capital coming in, like, seeing some of the kind of big investors put money in, that's another sign. The numbers growing, right? I mentioned, 19, 20 million players worldwide, seeing that go up, the number of courts go up. But I think more kind of, specifically, it's all well and good having growth, but how even is that growth across different countries? And is there oversupply in some markets because it's easier to build than others? Sweden is a great example. So Sweden is almost like the poster child for the boom and bust of padel. It's one market that didn't do it so well. They built way too fast, way too quickly during the pandemic. Smallish population, and a lot of the centres have now closed because they built too many for the people, and people went back to more traditional working practices. So, a lot of these courts were sitting idle. So look, I think, without diverging kind of too much from your question, I think it's like, okay, is the supply properly global, or is it just concentrated in certain countries and cities? So I think, there's a huge amount of the world where padel is not even being built out yet. Asia is a big market, itself. New Zealand, you've started along the journey, but I'm sure there's a lot to go in terms of.
Apparently, New Zealand went a bit nuts with squash in the 80s, I heard.
Okay, yeah.
So that's interesting because it's a similar rollout, right? So it's a similar adoption curve, really, of what it could be. Because there was a point in time when not everyone was playing squash.
100%. Squash had it's sad.
And like, squash, in a sense, is similar, right? Like, it can be 4 players. I mean, it's a bit cramped, but you can do it. But it's more of a 2-player sport. But it's a big investment because it's this big room.
100%. Like, squash had a great kind of era in New Zealand, the UK, many countries in like 70s to 90s. I grew up playing squash. And then it had, I don't know, in New Zealand if it's similar, but in England it had a bit of a come down in the early 2000s, and there was a big boom in gym culture, and a lot of these places got converted, and squash is not a great place across lots of the world. Look, I would say similarities. There are similarities with paddle and squash, 100%. You can play double squash. Squash is a harder game to play, I'd say. I think
it's much harder.
Paddle adoption has much more potential and is proving so. But squash did have its day, and it's quite sad how it's declined because it is a great sport. So look, we've got to kind of learn the lessons. But I think there are a lot of differences in terms of just the ability to get more people on court because of the ease of paddle. And it's, quite sticky. I wouldn't say squash is addictive in that way. It's a great workout. It definitely touched onto the corporate side, business people on their lunch breaks. It was the thing to do, right? But I think paddle has more ability to reach more people and be more attractive than squash and any other sport out there.
And for the business, like, what would that look like for the business itself, or your own personal like wealth? You're obviously investing in this sport, and if the sport delivers on what you think it will, then in natural theory you would get compensated for that, right? And you're designing your life to spend your time in an industry that you really enjoy, which is an important part of wealth too.
Absolutely. So look, what does that look like for me? It looks like, growing success commercially as a business. It means actually, more holistically working with interesting companies. I keep touching on the non-endemics. I work with a lot of paddle companies, clubs, professional tours. Equally, I've worked and I'm working with more brands, the type of brands I mentioned I'd like to see more in the sport, brands who have nothing to do with paddle but see an alignment or a kind of objective that can be realized through paddle. So working with more of them. I think it's, working with more founders who are getting into the sport and have their own kind of aspirations. And that could be PR, that could be connecting them with other business owners. So for me, it's the bigger play and kind of what I've evolved to doing is being a connector within the sport and bringing people together who have different interests, whether it's investing or being invested in, whether it's having land or looking for land, so if I can be that middle person, that to me is kind of the job satisfaction of bringing people together. and helping join the dots of a sport that's kind of got a lot of energy around it. And it's, in terms of the markets, I'm shortly to move to the US this summer. It's helping grow the profile of the sport in a country that is so large and has so much competing sport and kind of cultural.
Where would you go in America? Because obviously it's each state is
so different.
Even a city within a state, and that's all you need. So in terms of adoption and trying to think about critical mass, so what does that look like? What way?
I'm moving to Charleston, South Carolina, which is not a big hub. It's a lovely part of the country. It's not a big hub. I'm moving there from a kind of lifestyle point of view. It's a nice place to be. But where the sport is growing massively is South Florida, Miami.
Yeah, I was thinking that.
Yeah, and there's other. It's like a heat map. There's other parts. Texas has become a big state for paddle. Dallas, Austin, Houston, they've all become kind of paddle cities. Got the Northeast, New Jersey, New York, kind of big, wealthy kind of communities around there playing paddle, and then you've got California starting to adopt. So there's different parts, and obviously there's the whole kind of many states.
And why move to America?
Well, look, it's the world's biggest sports market. I've built up most of my clients and most of my kind of community there, and they've got a huge kind of potential with the sport. We know pickleball has been the racket sport that's grabbed the attention, but I think paddle is very much kind of the next wave, and there's. You've got a huge kind of racket sport playing population, number one. You've got a huge Hispanic and Latin community in America, and you've got a very kind of sports and trend loving culture. And I think it is the most interesting, or will be the most interesting paddle market internationally, just because of its scale and its approach to business. And I kind of early on saw an opportunity to kind of build up a community there and get to know what's going on. Right. And so that's why I focus on the UK and US, because I think that there's a lot the US can learn from the UK, which is ahead in terms of its paddle adoption. Right. So I'm moving there because of the future of where it's going, not where it is now. But I think the future is very bright for the sport for all the reasons I mentioned.
No, interesting. But it's just it's always interesting to think about when someone's talking about moving country, because it's kind of one of the craziest things you can do.
Sure is.
And getting everything sorted, and the older you are, the harder it is to make you can move. So that's quite interesting. And we talk about people moving away from the US and away from the UK. It's interesting, from our perspective, that you would pick the US, and it makes total sense because the stakes you get to play for are bigger there. Naturally a more competitive market, but in terms of reaching for your aspirations, quite a good cultural place to be for that. I think something contrary to the UK, and New Zealand has inherited a little bit of that from some of the UK kind of dynamics. I think, and the market size as well.
That's the reason for it. I've put a lot of energy into the early paddle market in the US, and it is early. There's not that many involved, but it's growing and growing. I've always been a big supporter of American culture, and I've always thought they've got a great business mentality and a very kind of can-do, proactive mentality to getting stuff done. And I see that in paddle, and I see that much more in the US than the UK, which has its pluses, but one of its minuses is they're less dynamic with business and less get up and go, I suppose, when they see an opportunity. There's definitely more. There's more, cost of living discussion, etc. In the US, there's more investment, and there's more, we want to do this and we want to build it out and we want to do it quickly mentality. And I think I see that kind of matching with my own. And I see that matching with paddles kind of energy. So I think that the future is bright, but it's going to take some time, right? Big population, big geography to fill out. And not easy also with the planning and regulations around building these courts as well in the US, state by state. It can be complex. But I think where there's a will, there's a way. And I think this sport has got a very bright future in America.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on the pod today. I think it was a really interesting one. I'm really interested to see where paddle goes. I think it's interesting around the timing in the US, and I would love to hear how it goes after the move and once you've kind of dropped into that market, because I find as a business study that actually is a lot of interest, I think, for founders in particular that are in smaller markets, but they want to know what these other markets are like and they want to operate at the same level, but they don't actually get to do it, or you get stuck, right? It's in, and sometimes it's easier once you're in to really be in a market.
The biggest challenge is making. You can have the idea to do it. The biggest challenge is executing it right, and it's no easy thing. Moving to the US is a big move, and it's not often an easy one. But I think, I think if you've got the ambition to do it, and you want to get on, and you have one life, right, and you want to kind of realize where the opportunities are with business, then anyone can make that move. So. If I can encourage in my own small way others to follow suit. Paddle's a great opportunity, as sport is, to travel with your work, right? It's an international industry, and there's so many opportunities out there, I think, beyond your own domestic borders. So it's an exciting time.
Awesome. Thank you.